Thank you for inviting me to talk about this paper. Is something rotten in the state of Denmark? Obviously, this is a clickbait title where we paraphrase a famous quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet. And you can interpret this in several ways, but one connotation is that we did a survey among Danish researchers concerning questionable research practices and compared it to an identical international survey to examine response patterns to see whether national practices were deviant. Um, we did actually not expect that to begin with, but since the funding for the general project called Practices, Perceptions and Patterns of Research Integrity mandated this national perspective, we framed it in this way. And I should also apologize a little bit because the paper is probably too dense in many ways, as we are trying to do several things, which is probably not a good strategy. But I will hopefully try to explain some or most of it in my talk here, and then we can discuss it. And for those of you who have read the paper, you have probably realized that it's not just a prevalence survey, it's also a conceptual and methodological paper that examines the concept of questionable research practices and critically engages with the measurement of prevalence. And also, but not in any detail, also raise some questions about the usual suspects of potential causes which are brought to the forefront when we discuss these issues. So before I start, you may ask yourself, Denmark, why? Where is it? Well, we're a small country, but our research system is very highly performing, which makes it quite interesting. And then also to remind you in this day and age that Denmark is actually a kingdom that constitutes both Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And as you can see, Denmark is very small. Greenland is very large. And for the time being, Greenland and the Faroe Islands are still part of Denmark. So enough of that. The agenda, I will try to motivate the survey or the paper, talk a little bit about the concept of questionable research practices, present the survey, present the results, but also discuss the many challenges we think there are in measuring prevalence, and then a little bit about predictors and some reflections at the end of it. Now, it is interesting when you look at the concept to actually try to see how it has been approached from different perspectives. And we look at it from two perspectives, the research integrity community and the meta-science community, which basically, or where that came from was actually psychology, and then it sort of went in to become the view within meta-science. This also means that we follow basically the terminology that the integrity community is using when they talk about ethics and integrity, where integrity and therefore also questionable research practices is sort of the research behavior viewed from the perspective of professional standards. And as you can see from this very crude timeline showing just simply the number of papers in Web of Science that mention questionable research practice in their title and abstract. Things have sort of grown after 2012, where this famous paper by John and co-authors were published. But it's actually interesting to go further back because the concept of questionable research practices is much older than that, and we will do that. Most of you, all of you, will know this paper. It is the paper that came out in 2012, and I will talk a little bit more about it later. But you can say that this is clearly by far the most cited publication on questionable research practice. I even think it's more cited than Daniel's meta-analysis, which is actually also more in the or systematic review, which is more concerned with fabrication and falsification. This paper has been hugely influential in defining questionable research practices, and also widely cited for the claims it puts out of widespread and even normative use of these questionable research practices. And I, as an anecdote, I was in a panel committee some years ago where a very prominent member of the meta-science community and I had a huge argument about questionable research practices, and I was told that they were clearly defined and so forth, which clearly, or the position was clearly that this paper had sort of outlined what questionable research practices were. You also know that together with the Simmons, Nielsen, and Simonson paper, these two papers have sort of become have formed the conception within the meta-science community about these questionable research practices being one of the main culprits, if not the main culprit, for the so-called reproducibility crisis, at least in social psychology. The point here is that this is a very, very narrow conception of questionable research practices. I will return to them in a moment, but it's fair to say that they are basically addressing issues with manipulating statistical inference and selective reporting. The thing is that the term questionable research practices, or the concept, is much older. And it even goes further back than 1992. But as far as we can see, this report from 1992 is the first one that tries to address these issues in a more, let's say, conceptual sense. And at this time, it was still very unclear to the authors of the report what exactly questionable research practices were. They clearly defined what misconduct was. It was fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. And questionable research practices to them were sort of actions that violate traditional values of the research enterprise and that may be detrimental to the research process, which means that was probably everything in between misconduct and not good practices. But of course, very difficult to define what good practices then would be. And as I say, this report and these definitions were, of course, politically driven in the US. It was centered around the US, the Office of Research Integrity in the US. So it sort of came in from another perspective. But the integrity perspective also grew over the years. And some of you may know that in 2005, there was a very also influential survey published in, I think, in Nature, where Martinson and colleagues also sort of raised the issues about scientists behaving badly. And the year after, Nicholas Stenek wrote sort of a programmatic paper where he sort of, for the first time, really outlined a conceptual framework for questionable research practices in the literature, situating it between responsible conduct of research and misconduct. Now, in 2017, the same author group here from the integrity community sort of introduced a new concept, namely detrimental research practices. And this was sort of a reflection that, reflecting on their own work over the years, reflecting upon the so-called reproducibility crisis and what the meta-science community were discussing, then they sort of decided that some of these practices were not just questionable, they were indeed detrimental, which I suppose means that we cannot debate whether they are good or bad practices or whatever. They seem to be sort of, in a normative sense, detrimental research practices. This term or concept has not been discussed much in the scientific literature but it still is present in the integrity community. So basically, where we are is that we assume that based especially on the claims made by John and also followed up in other studies, that questionable research practices, whatever they are, or narrowly defined, I should say, are widespread. The question is exactly what we are measuring here. Is it use or is it prevalence? I will come back to that. But this is a narrative, and of course the argument is that these questionable research practices or detrimental practices or whatever you would call them, they of course the individual act comes with several degrees of severity, but and they are not, of course, as severe as the actions of fabrication and falsification, perhaps also plagiarism. But the thing is, if they are widespread, they also have a huge impact or bias the literature. So that's basically the presumed idea of this. Then if we return to our survey, we actually set out to do what others have done, but our idea was to sort of broaden things up. And by this, we meant that we did not want to just study the narrow perspective on questionable research practices. We wanted to follow more in the tradition of the integrity community, where practices that could be linked to all kinds of steps in the research process could be sort of considered questionable. So we set out to look into the literature to find a number of suggested potential questionable research practices in order to get a pool of items for the survey. And we were inspired by this paper and others, and we quite quickly got a long list of this. But we also realized quite early on that much of this was really, many of these potential questionable research practices were really tied to specific kinds of knowledge production. Many or most of them come from the medical areas, and clearly they were not relevant for all kinds of researchers. So we realized that it was probably not a good idea to just sort of make a survey where we ask people what kind of field they were in, because within fields you can have different ways of doing research as well. So we had to do something else. We had to sort of tie the individual practices to certain kinds of preferred knowledge production modes within these fields. That also meant that we did I think 22 focus group interviews with researchers from basically all fields, and also hopefully from a diverse perspective of knowledge production. Then we asked them to reflect upon questionable research practices and also bring some potential practices to the table so that we could also select from that pool. And what was and I should say this goes some years back. I think it was in 2017 or 2018 or something like that. And we had to be, it was quite clear when we did the focus group interviews, these researchers had a very limited reflection on questionable research practices. They also had a very hard time distinguishing between quality criteria and what we would label as questionable research practices. So it was sort of a more mixed bag to them, but in the end, it was very fruitful, and we got a lot of potential research practices out of it. Now, if we then return to the John study, as I told you, this is really has been a hugely influential study in many ways. Most notably for the list of items they have used. These items have been reused in a number of subsequent surveys as well, and have more or less been corroborated in other surveys, which mainly have been targeted to other kinds of other communities of psychologists, but also within biology, as far as I remember, and communication sciences. It's sort of spread out, but it's usually the first 9 or variations of the first 9 QRPs which have been used in these surveys. What is also quite interesting is that this John study claims to be studying prevalence. And for those of you who have a medical background will know that prevalence is a specific term in epidemiology. And as you will see in a moment, it has been questioned whether this is actually prevalence which is being measured here. There are also some rather big claims in the study about widespread or even normative use. And there are also some issues in the way they pose the questions, because they actually ask, have you ever? And then the item comes, which sort of broadens up the perspective. But as I said, this has been really an influential study also for those who have sort of tried to reproduce it in other areas. The very, very interesting thing is that some years after this study came out, there was another study by Klaus Fiedler and Norbert Schwarz that was highly critical of the John study. They questioned the way they had formulated the items. They questioned whether they were actually measuring prevalence or just what you could say use. They also questioned the way they formulated, have you ever, instead of putting some time restriction on this. And they used this metaphor about have you ever attended church? If yes, how often have you attended church the last year? The latter would be a prevalence measure. Have you ever attended church in itself would just be what they would relate to a use measure, meaning that when you ask in that way, you will get a very high proportion of people saying, yes, we've been to church, or yes, we've done this and done that. Now, the interesting thing here is that this paper has not been neglected, I would say, but it has certainly not been sort of used in any way or discussed. I mean, you can agree or disagree with it, but that's not what we see when we look at the citation context to this paper. It is very rarely co-cited with the John paper, meaning basically that people ignore this critique from Fiedler and Schwarz. They don't even discuss it as a pro et contra when they sort of do their own analysis or discuss these things. Quite often, it is actually perfunctory cited as just another survey. But if you look into it, what they come up with is actually some arguments that the prevalence claims are overblown in the John study, and they should be much lower. So that was sort of where we kicked off from. We needed to broaden the perspective. We needed to examine the varying perceptions of questionable research practice. We needed to examine them across fields and link them to knowledge production models. We also needed to examine prevalence both conceptually, empirically, and methodologically. And also question whether it's possible to use these self-reported surveys to measure how widespread QRPs are. And we also needed to examine some of the associations between psychological and social factors on the one hand, and self-reported and perceptions of QRPs on the other hand. And how did we do that? Well, we constructed a rather complicated questionnaire. There are many things in the questionnaire which is not addressed in the survey. So I'll just skip this. You can see that in the supplementary material to the paper. And then I will show you the 25 potential QRPs that we actually included in here. And as you can see, they are a broad set of of practices related to citing practices, reviewing practices, many of these selective reporting practices, something about authorships, but also, of course, some of the let's say narrowly defined questionable research practicing relating to data dredging or manipulation of statistical significance test. And we did that, of course, to have something to compare to the other surveys. Then we also constructed a rather complicated way of allocating the questionable research practices to the respondents. The respondents had to sorry. The respondents had to select a preferred research approach, we called it. That was basically these knowledge production modes. And that would be something, if they were basically non-empirical researchers, then the primary were philosophical, literary, conceptual, mathematical, algorithmic. They could also be qualitative researchers, and they could sort of align to quantitative research. And if they did quantitative research, they could select between doing statistical significance test or not statistical significance test. And to each of those four different preferred research approaches, we had linked the pool of 25 questionable research practices. Some of these potential questionable research practices were general for all. I mean, you could ask about authorships to all respondents, but some of them were clearly tied to the specific knowledge production mode. So we developed this rather elaborate scheme of both randomly select a number of QRPs to each respondent dependent on the preferred approach, and some of them were also mandatory. I think the ones which are underscored here are the mandatory ones, but I can't remember. But anyways, the idea was that all respondents should get 9 questions, simulating the previous John study. And as I said, some of them were mandatory, some of them were randomly given or assigned to them along the way. This is just to show the actual wording of the different questionable research or potential questionable research practices. Now, the actual grading in the scheme was so that we presented each respondent with a vignette up here, and then they were asked first to perceive the prevalence of this practice within the recent you could say we framed it as recent publications that they read within their specific field of research. So it was basically, we asked them to guesstimate, you could say, what their gut feeling or perception was of how prevalent this practice would be in within their specialty. And then subsequently, we asked them to self-report their own use of this practice in their recent sole or co-authored publications. And this sort of was a standard for all nine of these potential questionable research practice items. Response rates, well, they were not great. I should, of course, say that we did 2 surveys. We did 2 surveys, 2 identical surveys, one among all Danish researchers from, we excluded PhD students, but from postdoc and upwards. And we did the same in 10 research institutions internationally in the UK, the US, Croatia, and Austria. And as you can see, the response rates were not impressive. They were okay in Denmark if you sort of take the usual social science standard, which is still not okay, but it's what you get, I guess, often get. and it was, of course, very low when you look at the international response rate. But to us, and this should not be seen as any excuse, but what we were really most interested in, knowing that we have a lot of self-selection here, is basically to compare the two sets of responses to see whether response patterns were sort of similar. So we did not merge the two sets. We sort of analyzed them separately. Now, if we look at the problems with measuring this, then you can see over here, you can see the distributions of the perceived prevalence, where we ask people to guesstimate, and you can see that this sort of fluctuates. There are variation across the scale in some of them, or in most of them. Whereas if you look at the self-reported distribution of the self-reported, you can see that clearly we have a very skewed distribution, where for almost all of the 25 QRPs, you will see a high proportion of people saying no, and then you will and that's in no recent publications. And then you can see there is a tail here which is clearly concentrates around 1, because the scale is sort of constructed in a way so that the higher up the scale, the more you admit you have done it in recent publications. So you could say when people admit or self-report that they have used it, they usually say that they have only used it very little in these recent publications. Fair enough. So what is self-reported use? Yeah, that's what you could argue John and others have looked at. This is actually when you sort of make the scale binary. So you look at all of those who admit, which in our case would be those up here, and then you simply just make a proportion out of that. And the proportion of yes would then be the proportion of those who self-admit to have used this particular potential questionable research in recent publications. Not how often they have used it, just that they have used it. And this gives us this result, which is ranked ordered according to the Danish results. The blue ones, and yeah, what we can see here is, first of all, there are the whiskers can tell you that there are some variations, of course, where where the number of respondents have been lowered. We can also see that there is a fairly strong correlation between the response patterns from the Danish and international surveys. The tau is about 0.85. What we can also see, if we look at the general statistic, is 9 out of 10 respondents, give and take. Well, no, it was actually quite solid. 9 out of 10 respondents admit at least one of the 9 QRP items, and the median was at self-reporting 3 out of the 9. And what we can also clearly see here, or infer from the response patterns, is some kind of social desirability. I have not included the figure. We had some figures where people should grade the severity, their perceived severity of the practice. But for instance, the last one down here, plagiarizing, was actually included in here because we would expect it to be lowest, because this is clearly the one that we would expect most people to think. Well, you could argue that it is actually a misconduct. So we would expect it to be down here as it is. And we would also expect something like citing issues to be on top, simply for the fact that people do not probably think that this is as problematic as other practices, and therefore these responding to these practices would probably not require or be infected as much with social desirability. And if you look at selective citing, then we could argue that most are willing to admit this, and it also seems to be some kind of normative, because I will show you in a moment that there are pretty good signs that the rationale here would be that you will say to yourself that others are doing it as well. And of course, the fact that there is a very low risk and probably something to gain, even though it becomes inflated over time, is probably also a factor. But I think what's most pronounced, of course, is that yes, self-reported use, when we measure it this way, will give you some pretty high numbers. But also what I find quite interesting is that the response patterns are so similar. And by the way, if you compare where we can compare with other items, we cannot compare all of them, but where we can compare with other items in other surveys, the proportions are very similar. But as I will conclude later, we could also raise the question whether this is actually has something to do with the instrument. Then we come to prevalence. And prevalence becomes a little bit more complicated, at least the way I've presented it here. It's not that complicated. But what actually happens, according to Fiedler, is that if we want to say something about prevalence, we do not want to say whether people have just gone to church. We want to know how often they go to church. Or put it another way, we're not so interested in whether they have done this QRP recently. We are interested in how often they have practiced or used it. And this means that we will sort of remove all those who have said no, and only concentrate on the rest of the scale, meaning all those who have actually admitted self-reported use. And then we use some kind of a transformation, which you can do this in many ways, but we sort of made a weighted mean on the scale, transformed it into this sort of pump thing. It's explained in the paper. At the end of the day, you get two numbers out. You get sort of a number that represents the activity on the scale, and this is case 0.4, and you multiply that with the proportion of respondents who have actually said yes. And when you do that, you get, in this case, a number like this. And you can actually see it from this way. This is the self-reported use. And this is actually the self-reported prevalence when you sort of multiply it with the activity on the scale. And as you can see from this, it's again, blue is Danish. It is only Denmark. I will return to the black, but to the red one in a moment. But the blue here is the self-reported prevalence, again ranked from highest to lowest. But you can see now we have moved down the scale. The prevalence of all these questionable research practices become considerably lower. Actually, when we sort of measure it, it depends a little bit, it varies a little bit, but on average, use is 3 times higher compared to prevalence. Now, the red one is actually the one, the question about perceived prevalence, where we ask the respondents to perceive prevalence. As you can see here, it is a general thing, and you see that in surveys, in similar surveys that ask these sort of controversial questions about own behavior, that there is this gap between what people admit and what they sort of perceive others do. And this gap has sometimes been called normative dissonance or the dissolution gap. And it is argued that you use that to sort of legitimize your own behavior. What this really sort of or what came out of this for us was really whether we need more of these surveys, because they seem to sort of just reproduce the same picture. And then we can argue back and forth between use and prevalence and so forth. But I will bet you a good bottle of red wine that if you redo a survey like this, you will see some similar response patterns. And this is just the same for the international survey. But if you study that in detail, you will see the same pattern. Then finally, we also looked at some predictors. And since some of my colleagues were psychologists, they insisted that we should also look at personal traits. And we debated that back and forth. And initially, they suggested to look at the dark triad, but we refrained from doing that because, as some of you know, the dark triad has sometimes been, I would say, weakly correlated to misconduct. But clearly, when we're talking about questionable research practices, we are talking about all of us, and not just a rotten apple in the barrel. So we needed something else, and therefore we ended up using a very scaled down version of the big five personality traits. What came out of all this? Well, perceived pressure. We had two. I should say we had two batteries of questions that sort of reflect some of the systemic issues that has been linked to questionable research practices, or perhaps more general to research integrity breaches. And one of them was this thing about pressure. We had a number of questions about pressure to get funding, pressure to get published, and all that. But we also had questions that sort of looked into the local culture at centers and departments, to what extent they engaged in discussions about quality and had internal red tape, peer review stuff, and stuff like that. And as you can see, perceived pressure was the strongest systemic predictor for prevalence, as expected. What was not expected, I would say, was that the most respondents, irrespective of whether they were professors or postdocs, were really scoring high on this. So professors were also at least reporting a perceived pressure in the high end. We can also see that the local culture, the stronger, the more engagement you had at your department and center, the less you reported self-reported prevalence or use of questionable research practices. Of course, you could argue that there could be some reverse causality in both of these predictors. But perhaps also interesting is to look at openness and conscientiousness. As far as I know, I've not seen big five studies used on researchers before, but I've seen it used several times on students at universities. And there you also see that especially conscientiousness and openness are often negatively related to let's say, more of bad practices. So this is also something that we expected if there were to be any correlation between some of these personality traits. But look at the percentage points. We are talking very, the effect sizes are quite small here. But I think what could be indicated from this study, from this way of correlating things, is that usually the argument is that it's the incentives, it's the hyper competition in the system, but maybe this also suggests that it is not only incentive structures that cause these things, because we can clearly see that behaviors are not uniformly distributed over this, meaning that we are not equally susceptible to falling prey to these incentives. So some are more willing to follow incentives and cut corners or whatever, or at least this raises a question whether it's always the incentives to blame if indeed there is a problem. So is something rotten in the state of Denmark? Well, main findings would be that we find similar response patterns across fields and countries overall, and we're directly comparable. Both the self-reported use is similar to many studies. Self-reported prevalence rate are higher compared to Fiedler and Schwartz. I would argue that that is probably due to us having a broader set of questionable research practices where you can judge them with more variation in their severity. We could also say that when we look at use, then most of us engage with questionable research practices on and off, which is probably not unreasonable, indicating a systemic but not systematic use, and most likely not always intentional. I will return to this in my final slide in a moment. And findings actually suggest lower prevalence in the literature than often claimed. So figuratively speaking, something does not seem to be rotten in Denmark. And as I said before, finding it also suggests that not everybody is equally likely to succumb to problematic system-wide incentives. But clearly there are indications of social acceptability in response patterning, meaning that some of these practices are probably normative. And it's also important to acknowledge that that knowledge production models are susceptible to both common and specific questionable research practices. And if you look at authorship issues, typically in the medical literature, honorary authorships are debated a lot and used a lot, and are probably a huge problem. It inflates many things, especially it inflates and makes it harder for younger researchers to but in other fields, this is not an issue. For instance, if you think of experimental physics, where they don't talk about authorships but contributorships, and they have these extremely long list of contributors on their papers. There are many challenges and problems with this and other surveys. I have already discussed some of them. I don't want to go through. You can see them here, but I still think it's worth discussing what we are measuring and how we should interpret it, and how we should explain that response patterns are similar across our two surveys and generally between most surveys. And as I said, my gut feeling is that it has more to do with the instrument and general response behaviors among researchers to such questions rather than stable prevalence estimates. I also think it's safe to conclude that questionable research practices are widespread in the sense that most of us engage with them from time to time. It seems inevitable given their nature. And I will just finish with stating why I think that's inevitable. Yeah, and I did think it's an unresolved question how often we engage with particular questionable research practices, whether use is systematic, and therefore how prevalent certain questionable research practices are in the literature, and thus their impact. And the reason why is because questionable, at least in the English language, means doubtful as regard to truth and validity, but in Danish, the term refers to debatable, which often means open to dispute. And most potential questionable research practices are tied to specific epistemic positions, are more or less socially acceptable, are situational, and are not fixed entities. And the QRP label is then used, when used as sort of a universalizing manner, and has become supercharged and encourages blanket exclusions of certain practices and homogenizes other research practices. And I think clearly we need to have epistemic diversity reflected in these discussions. And this is not to say that we should acknowledge that practices cannot be questionable or detrimental. They certainly can be that. But it is to say that we need more pluralistic approaches to tackle such issues. As an anecdote, I have been discussing with economists at my university many times about data dredging. It's not, I mean, economists that does register-based analyses, they know a lot about data dredging, have been discussing it for many, many years. There's a famous paper from '83 by Lima on that. They know that they are data dredging, but as they say, this is simply something that is a necessity or a generic thing on the way we develop our models. Is it a questionable research practice? Well, if you come from psychology, you will immediately demand them to pre-register and say that they are p-hacking, whereas many economists would say, no, this is simply just something which is a part of the way we do research within this knowledge production mode. And I think that's worth considering. So it seems difficult to make general statements about the goodness or badness of these practices, or some of them at least. Thank you.